RETEACH, podcast for teachers seeking fresh viewpoints, deeper subject knowledge, and diverse thinking.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the RETEACH Geography podcast for teachers seeking fresh viewpoints, deeper subject knowledge, and diverse thinking. Visit reteach.org.uk/subject/geography for resources to help you offer students broader perspectives on key topics and free-to-access guides, all written by subject experts. I'm your host, Kit Marie Rackley, and my pronouns are they, she. Today, I'm joined by someone from the geography teacher community who I know very, very well, and I have collaborated with on many occasions. Kate Stockings is head of geography at a London school, an active blogger, sharer of ideas, and supports many educational organisations to enhance the teaching of geography. Welcome, Kate. It's great to see you again.
Hi, Kit. Thank you. Thanks for having me onto the podcast.
To give a bit of context to everybody is the reason why podcasts like this are so great is because if you're a teacher, you'll be aware. If you're not a teacher, you're listening to this because you're interested in the whole extended reading and that kind of thing, is that teachers are a really close-knit community, and we have our own communities. So we have the Geography teacher community, and just last week, Kate, we were both at the Geographical Association's annual conference in Sheffield. So how did you find it?
Yeah, it was really good. It was really good to be back face-to-face. Last year we had kind of a hybrid one, and then this year was the first proper kind of buzzing face-to-face, I'd say. So it was really good to be back. Really great to be in Sheffield and have a really high turnout of geographers talking geography.
It was buzzing is a great word. And one of the things that we do, folks, is we do talk about, best practice. We share practice, we learn from each other. And one of the things we talked about at the conference was about wider reading. So, and Kate is with us today because one of the things that Kate does quite a fair bit is make some fantastic physical resources and fantastic guides for students and for teachers. And we're going to be talking about something called Top Spec Geography, the Climate Crisis. So then, Kate, tell us what this is about, what Top Spec Geography is, the series, what that is, and specifically kind of like what you tried to achieve with the Climate Crisis version.
So the Top Spec is a series of books by the GA that aim to take A-level students kind of above what they might do in school. So the target market is your A-star, A-grade students, but that's not to say that it's exclusively for them. Hopefully all students would get something from looking at it. But the idea is that it's written by an academic and a teacher. So you have two people that work on each book, and the academic brings their expertise from the university world, and then the teacher tries to ensure that that's accessible and scaffolded in such a way that A-level students can engage with it. So it's written, as I say, for that kind of higher attaining A-level student. But actually, what I found really useful when looking at the books is they're actually really useful for teachers as well, because they often hone in on areas of our subject knowledge that we might need a refresh on or might want to go into more depth on. And so they're a really good tool for teachers as well as students. So the series editor, Bob Digby, got in contact and said, would you like to work with Tim Daly on the Climate Crisis book for Top Spec, which was really exciting. It was a little bit daunting because climate change is obviously very much what everyone's talking about at the moment and what everyone's thinking about. So it felt like quite a big responsibility to be involved with this book in particular, but really exciting as well, because as a teacher, I knew that I needed to keep my climate change subject knowledge bang up to date. I knew that I needed to look into more depth in different areas. So I was really excited to take on the project at the time.
There is this an increasing collaboration between academics and teachers to do things like this. So for those of you folks who haven't heard of Dr. Tim Daly, Dr. Tim Daly is Associate Professor of Physical Geography at the University of Plymouth, I believe. Yeah. So he's got a very deep expertise in this kind of thing. And I know that he's a very, very strong science communicator as well. So so you both have that overlapping expertise as well, whereas Tim's got that, climate and environmental science expertise, you've got that teaching, that communication expertise, and then you've both got that overlap of being able to be very effective science communicators. And the other thing I was going to say as well, Kate, which I think is great about Top Spec Geography and Top Spec series, is that quite a few students find the transition between A-level and undergraduate, if that's what they want to do, quite challenging. And this is a fantastic resource for those who really do want to pursue these kind of issues at an undergraduate level and I've definitely heard, in some cases that a lot of us said, well, the work that I did with this and through TopSpec has actually allowed me to access what I've done at university a lot more easier.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right to kind of mention Tim's expertise, because my goodness, is he an expert? And it was fantastic to work with him. And the GA were wonderful in that they gave us the topic, which was climate change. I think they possibly mentioned the climate crisis, but they gave us the topic of climate change and very much left it to us to say, Kate, you know what's out there, you know what teachers need, go in whatever direction you want to. So Tim and I very quickly, working with his expertise, but also my knowledge of what resources already existed, we went down this angle of the climate crisis. That's what the title of the book is. And we went down this angle of actually, why are we in a climate crisis? There are so many resources out there about the impacts of climate change, about the causes of climate change. Teachers know where to go. The Met Office, the IPCC are doing amazing work on that as well as the big publishers. So that's kind of covered for geography teachers. But what we felt, or what I felt, was a big gap was actually we've known about climate change for over 40 years. And why are we in this position today? Why is it a climate crisis? And although there are many people that could explain that to us, I wasn't aware of a resource that actually broke that down and took the time to say, here's the history, here's the reason why we are in this situation after 20, 30, 40 years. So what we hope and what I think we've done in the book is really focusing on that. Why are we in a climate crisis? We do touch on the drivers of climate change. We do have a chapter about that, which goes into a lot more detail than A-level students will have come across. We do touch on impacts and solutions, but this isn't kind of a book to teach you the impacts in a huge amount of depth. We took a different lens, which was that climate crisis angle. Why are we in it? Why have we not taken action? So it was really enjoyable to learn about that as much as anything else.
Yeah, and the research suggests many different views, but if I give one example from Catherine Walker's Young People at Crossroads, for example, that research and many other research from a lot of environmental charities categorically states that this is what the youngsters want. The youngsters are done with, the basics, causes, impacts, solutions. They want to know the nuances. They want to know why we got here. They want to focus on the climate justice. So, which is why I feel that, the work that both you and Tim done is going to be far more impactful, and allows for a whole range of approaches. So they're not siloed into just looking at the meteorological, climatological kind of impacts and things like that. But if they want to go down the justice route, they can. If they want to go down the historical route, they can. If they want to go down, things to do with migration resilience, climate resilience, they can go down that route.
Yeah,
so it's very important.
We kind of, unfortunately, there wasn't infinite space in the book. So there wasn't space to do the justice element that we would have liked to do. But what we were able to do with the lens that we decided to take was we were able to, where we did talk about impacts and possible solutions, we did that through a really synoptic viewpoint. So again, using my knowledge of A-level geography, tried to make sure that we actually drew out those links to the other elements of geography that they learn about in the A-level. So like one example in chapter 4, where we're talking about the impacts of climate change, we talk about it through a risk management approach, which our students will know about from tectonics, but they probably are highly likely to have kind of siloed that into, in tectonics, I learned about risk management and a risk management approach of vulnerability and hazards and risk. But have they actually thought about climate change in that way? And we kind of drew a synoptic link there and got them thinking in a slightly different way. In chapter 5, where we talk about the complexity of the climate crisis, we talked about the Kuznets curve and we linked that to globalization. Right. And we said, actually, have you thought about, when you're looking at emissions and when you're thinking about whether emissions have increased or decreased, have you actually thought about the fact that China has imported many Western emissions? And have you considered that link between globalization, which we know you've done in detail in A-level geography, but have you linked that to climate change? And hopefully teachers would agree that we do that quite well in the book, that getting them to think about climate change and how it links to all those different areas, rather than just climate change is a thing I learn about in this topic and that's that.
Yep. So on the RETEACH website, your book appears on the list written by Catherine Owing, How a Systems Approach Can Help Us Understand Climate Change. And she writes this: top spec geography books from the Geographical Association are aimed at A-level students, but are also useful reading for teachers who want to improve their subject knowledge, and that's absolutely key. This book is co-authored by the Deputy Director of the Sustainable Earth Institute and a teacher and head of geography at an 11 to 18 comprehensive school. While Daly brings his climate science expertise, Stockings ensures that this is clearly communicated in a way that is useful to A-level students. And as in A-level specification, this book takes a systems approach to the climate emergency, looking at how the carbon cycle changes over time and the impacts that these have, developing students' understanding of this complex topic. So as you can see, Catherine's really nailed, kind of like what you've tried to achieve there, and that's how it appears on the RETEACH recommended list. Do you have any comments to what Catherine has said there?
No, amazing. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for summing it up in that way, because systems thinking, I think, is something we still need to tap into as teachers. I think it's implicit within the specifications. I think it's implicit for many of us, but for many geography teachers, it's not explicit in what we do. And there are many schools out there that probably still don't really think about that systems thinking approach, and so we've definitely got some work to do there, I think.
But that's what makes it all exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Question for you then. So you visit a different school rather than your own to give a talk, right? And you notice your book in the staff library or the student library or both. What do you think it is about your book and Tim's book that might be compelling to students and teachers? I know you've alluded that to already, but specific, and you've already mentioned about thinking about how emissions work. What do you reckon would be the most compelling thing about the book for the students or the teachers?
I think again it comes back to the approach we chose to take about just making it a bit different, and the chances are you pick up this book, you open it, and you're like, oh, this is new. Like, I know some of this, but the vast majority of this I don't know, which is slightly different to a lot of climate change or textbooks that discuss climate change, where you pick it up and you're kind of like, yeah, I know most of this. There might be the odd sentence that introduces some new content, but the vast majority of it is kind of going over old ground. That's not, of course, talking about published books about climate change. I'm talking about textbooks and specific kind of geography education resources. So when you pick up and open it, we do unashamedly get quite nitty gritty quite quickly. Well, the whole thing is very nitty gritty about the climate crisis. So at the beginning, we don't shy away from talking about like UN climate change conventions, UN climate change frameworks, the IPCC reports in a lot of nitty gritty detail. That's the only way I could kind of sum up those opening chapters. They really are like, whoa, this is telling me the history. But if you want to understand why we're in the position we're in 2023, Tim and I believe that you need to read that and you need to know what has happened to get us to this point. So I hope it's compelling for that reason, that we are looking at why we got to this point and introducing you to why we got to this point in a way that I haven't seen done before. So kind of chapter 1 and chapter 2 really focus around these 4 main reasons as to why it's taken us over 30 years to get to our level of understanding. And this, for me, if we're talking about teachers improving their subject knowledge, this was new ground for me. I suppose I did know a little bit about the 4 reasons, but I certainly didn't know the depth and probably wouldn't have been able to explain them to students. So we talk about the 4 reasons being, number 1, we had to work out whether or not the late 20th century was unusual or not. So we had to work out if the warming was unusual. That took a lot longer than you might imagine and is a lot more complex than perhaps, everyday people imagine. Number 2, we had to use the models to look at causes of climate change, and that is inherently linked to number 3, which is modelling uncertainty and working with that to work out what we know and what we don't know. And then number 4 is the really interesting one for me as a kind of more human geography teacher, is actually the procrastination that we have had as a result of things like the global financial crisis in 2008 and how that has impacted this inaction over the last 30, 40 years. So in terms of the main takeaway, the main thing that makes it compelling, I think it's that. I think it's that discussion of why are we in this situation, looking at those 4 reasons in depth.
Yeah, and as someone who's got a lot of expertise and training and knowledge about climate science and working with climatologists and having a climate change background myself, that number 3, it brings me so much joy and relief that is being communicated. And that is what is meant by climate uncertainty, what is meant by modelling uncertainty, what is meant by a range of different possible scenarios. How do you generate those? Why are they important? Because that is severely miscommunicated, by people who don't have that knowledge, and sometimes not by nefarious purposes. People hear the word uncertainty and then they go ahead and they go, well, okay, the climate scientists are still not sure about what's going on. Whereas from a scientific modelling projection point of view, it's actually critical and good science. So it brings me a lot of joy as someone with a climate science background that you really do. So for me, the question is, and follow up is, the question I was going to ask you is like, what would be the thing that the students must take away if they were to take away one thing? For me, it would be how to understand what is meant by scientific uncertainty. So what about for you?
Well, so I did cheat on this one. I did write down an answer. I wrote down an answer to this one because I was like, there is no way I want to blabber on rather than a one-liner. So the one-liner that I've written down, if there's one thing I'd like teachers and students to take away, it's this. So we can explain why it took us over 30 years to reach the level of understanding that we now have. Some people may say that elements of that is making excuses for inaction and procrastination cannot be excused, but that's another discussion. What is the situation now, though, is that we do have that understanding. In 2023, we do understand what has happened and why. And so now we have to take action and it has to be done now. The kind of overall message is we have the understanding. So our governments, our TNCs, our communities need to take action and we need to do it now.
Yeah, perfect. And
that was my, it's not one line, it's 3 lines.
Right.
But that was my 3-line type answer to ensure that I got the key takeaway summarized.
Perfect. And scientists do not use terms like unequivocal unless they have the scientific data to back it up. That is a powerful word in science. So yeah, that's what unequivocal, and then your 3 lines would be the perfect tagline, I think.
We'll get it printed. Just a geography class
or something.
Yeah.
So okay, we obviously know you've become a geography teacher, but not just a geography teacher, but someone who's been exceptionally motivated and inspired to kind of give so much back to the geography teach community by the work that you do. So when you were in school or college, were there any particular books or written material that inspired you maybe to become a teacher, or maybe even think, you know what, if I ever get the chance, I'd love to do this myself, or I'd love to kind of enhance this text that I see and then open it up to the world? And can you recall anything like that when you were in your younger days?
Sort of, but to be honest, so my A-levels were in geography, biology and economics, which was like a dream combination. I just loved them and loved that combination. It was just so great. But I remember really clearly at the beginning of sixth form being told about the importance of extra reading and being given like reading lists and all this stuff. And I did try, I did get a couple of books out from the library, but I very quickly struggled to connect what I was being told to read with what we were actually doing. And I think perhaps the teachers, and they were all fantastic teachers, but perhaps they didn't quite make it kind of clear why we were being told to do that. It felt so distinct from what we were doing in class. So I wasn't very good at extra reading at school. And actually, although I read a huge amount now, I actually had a good few years off of reading. When I was doing my A-levels and at university, I did not read for pleasure. When I say pleasure, obviously non-fiction geography books as well. Just because that period of your life, you have to do so much reading anyway, that to sit in the evening or to sit on the train and voluntarily read just kind of felt, alien. And so there was a big period where I actually didn't read. And I'm probably not a model example of extra reading. But the one exception would be that it was during my A-levels that I became a reader of The Economist. and I've stuck with that ever since. I know obviously it has its flaws. I know there were flaws of kind of being wedded to one source of information. But for me, it is my kind of starting point that I use to then explore other things. And so I am a very loyal reader of The Economist for my subject knowledge. I find it fantastic. I find it really, really good to keep me up to date, particularly when we're thinking about the teaching of superpowers and migration, identity, sovereignty, and globalization. Actually, let's chuck that one in there as well. So that started during my A levels. So that was probably the limit of my reading when I was at school, although that's not a bad limit because there's a huge amount in it. But that's where my my loyalty to The Economist started, and I've stuck with it ever since and find it incredibly useful. So yeah, a bit of a mixed answer. I'm certainly not a model example of extra reading when I was at school.
Well, it's equally valid though, because we can't expect everybody to be to go into that wider extended reading. Simply, most of us just don't simply have the time. So that's why you mentioned the publication like The Economist, or you've got National Geographic magazine, for example, and they can be a more accessible way because you can get an issue and then you can focus on only one single article that may only take you 15, 20 minutes to read. So there are ways of gaining that extra reading without having to rely on reading maybe a whole text, a whole book or something. So
yeah, and what I've tried to do over the last few years as well, which I don't remember doing at school, but I'm happy to be corrected by any of my teachers. But I don't remember any gentle exposure to academic papers. And so I remember arriving at university and being like, what is this? Like you're talking about Harvard referencing, you're talking about academic papers, you're talking about journals, and you're using this word journal, and no one's actually sat me down and told me what a journal is. So you kind of have to pick it up as you go along. And I know universities have done a lot of work over the last decade. It kills me to call it a decade, but it is a decade. I know universities have done a lot of work over the last decade to kind of correct some of that and make sure that when undergrads arrive, they are kind of gently taken through the mechanics of academic reading. But I don't remember any of that happening. And so what I'm really trying to do now, actually like tweeted one only yesterday, is find high quality open access papers that can be a really gentle introduction. And so they might not be the best paper about glacial science, but the one I found yesterday was a really gentle introduction to the value of glaciers for food security, water security, energy security. And I just looked at it and thought, my goodness, this is fantastic to introduce students to journals and to academic writing. And that's what I'm trying to do. And it's really difficult because you can't do it too often because you simply don't have the time. So I cannot dissect an academic paper with our A-level students once a week. We just don't have the time. We probably can't even do it once a half term, which is the sad reality. So we're talking kind of once a term. But then if we can do that once a term, that's 6 times over their A-levels that we would really slowly, and when I say slowly, because I think it takes about an hour to kind of do in the way that I like to do. And so you've just got that constant balance between wanting to do it and absolutely seeing the value, and then just the curriculum time challenges that we obviously know exist so well. But that's kind of where I've been up to with extra reading most recently. And just final thing on kind of academic papers, for me, having only worked in comprehensives, I don't think it's the sort of thing they can do at home, which is part of the challenge. Is that I can't say to them, take this academic paper and read it at home, because they won't get from it what we think they'll get from it. I just don't think they will, because they're so different and they're so challenging. And so then it does have to be to something that you do in class and you dissect and you give an hour at least over to.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you say. And for me, what I did when I was teaching was, take out phrases, passages, or maybe if you can push it, maybe just the abstract, and then do it as a flipped piece of homework and bring it in and, and try and use it that way. But it is such a challenge. But on the same note, so you mentioned there about you have tried to use some academic journals, like maybe with Glacier, stuff like that. Have you got any other examples maybe where you've tried to use further reading within your lessons? Maybe have you ever tried to drop in a paragraph or a page from a fiction book within your teaching, or any other extended source?
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I've done a lot since 2020 because it was a side effect of having time to read during lockdown one.
Right. Yeah.
And I know that wasn't the case for everybody, and everyone had very different circumstances. But for me personally, I did a huge amount of reading in that first lockdown and had this vast number of books that I'd collected and never read.
Yeah.
So I just systematically worked my way through them and absolutely loved it. And it's what kind of kick-started my passion for reading again, having had those years off previously when at university. So I've continued it since, really loved it, but it was due to lockdown one that I kind of started. And what I found, as you know, and as many geographers know, is you pick up a book and very quickly you're like, my goodness, I need to use this in lesson.
Yeah.
Like grab the highlighter, grab the pencil. And then you start kind of highlighting and you start picking out those extracts that you're going to use in your lessons. And there are so many examples of where I've done that, so many examples of where I've used quotes from books to kind of depersonalize it and take it away from my opinion and my bias and my privilege, whatever, depending on what context topic you're talking about, you know, pick the applicable term I just used. But using a quote to empower your lesson. So quotes from Greta Thunberg, for example, quotes from Tim Marshall, Prisoners of Geography, all loads of different examples, but always talking to the students about, like, what is this person saying? What is their background? What is their lens through which they're saying this, and how can we discuss that? So lots of quotes in lessons now, lots of extracts. So again, coming back to Prisoners of Geography, I'm thinking about something like contested borders when you teach migration, identity, sovereignty, that whole section about Israel, Palestine, about the Kurds and Kurdish kind of issues, all of that stuff. It's actually so helpful to say, right, here's a chapter of somebody who's written about it. Here's another source as well, but let's have this as our starting point. Has just been really useful, and really useful for workload as well, just to take the pressure away from me about having to script it for myself, etc., etc. So done a lot of that, and then a couple of examples of structuring a whole scheme of work around a piece of text. But that for me is very limited because there are so few books out there that are appropriate to do that with. So one thing, and I know you agree with me on this, but one thing I think we've got to be really careful of as geographers is that we don't just see these books and think, amazing, I'm going to use it for a Key Stage 3 scheme of work because it was such a good book. Yes, it was such a good book. I don't disagree. But is it appropriate to structure a scheme of work around it? Because if the book achieves breadth without depth, is it appropriate to use that at Key Stage 3? Because it's the risk that you're just doing so much prep that they're not actually getting exposed to really powerful geography. Because if we do that, we're falling into misconceptions, we're falling into single stories, we're falling into all the dangers that we know about. And I think as literature becomes really embedded into our geography practice, as it rightly should, we have just got to be really careful of these lethal mutations around using books and around using book extracts, because I'm starting to see some of it kind of creep in the online Twitter world, and I think we need to have a discussion about it.
Yeah, there's the example I gave at the conference for our talk was using a descriptive passage from Cold by Bill Streever, you know, talking about the landscape, the glacial landscape and the processes, that's but in a very, very kind of like lyrical, prosy way. But then I said, well, what I then did is that was the plenary from the last lesson. For the starter activity for the next lesson, I used the diagram, annotated diagram from Horrible Geography, Freaky Peaks. So I got two different sources of information there, you know, rather than just relying on one, or even, you know, as you just say, an entire book. Yeah, and I will mention one. I mean, perhaps maybe you were holding back, but I don't mind mentioning it.
I was going to say, you're going to be braver than me, Kit. Go on.
No. It's so. For example, like you know, Factfulness by Hans Rosling and those folk, and there is so many fantastic good messages, but to formulate a whole scheme of work about that can be quite dangerous. Unless you take the time and you make sure that you go through it with a critical lens. I mean, the messages that about how you should think are valid from that, but you've got to also look at the alternatives point of view. And again, where's the bias in it? It is written from a Western professor's and his family's, you know, a white colonial point of view. So all of that has got to be taken with a bit of nuance. And it is challenging because, as you said yourself, Kate, we've only got so much amount of time. But this is where conversations really, really help, and seeing if there's anybody who's read the same things or written about the same topic coming from a different lens. And I always used to say, if you haven't got time to read something, find a small group of people who have read it, who can point you to certain passages or certain counter arguments or something like that. So, and that's why community and collaboration is so important.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. I'm going to ask you one last question then before we wrap up. So, and I really want to know this one because I work in the same area and I battle with this myself, and I'll read it out word for word. So what drives you to contribute generating content for textbooks and lesson resources, given that we live in the age of the internet and digital sharing, and we're saturated with so much information? Because I'm still battling with that myself.
Yeah. Oh God, it's a really interesting question. But I suppose the answer is because we're saturated with so much information, right? So because there is so much out there and there's so much information overload, but not just the information, resources. There is an infinite number of places to turn to get geography resources. But quality and quality assurance remains a massive thing. So I think thinking about information, like, yes, there is so much out there. And with the rise of kind of chat GPT and AI, there's going to be even more. We still need people to take the time and to take the effort to distill that information, to make it workable and to make it usable, particularly in the geography classroom, because we have been through the eras of geography being weakened and geography being taught in a way where it probably wasn't actually very good geography. And so if we don't have geographers who are passionate about sifting through and thinking, actually, this is really good to use and this is not, then we're going to fall into that trap again of geography for geography's sake rather than really powerful geography. It's really difficult because I think you're similar to me, but correct me if I'm wrong, but we tend not to put stuff out there that we don't agree with. So I would say I've never kind of blogged and said, don't use this, just because you are then putting yourself out there for kind of attack. But that is part of it, isn't it? Is that we see the information and think, oh, I'm not going to use that for this reason, and I'm not going to use that resource for this reason. But are we sharing that thinking and sharing that kind of thoughts around what we should be using and what we shouldn't be using? So I think even in the age of saturation with information, there is definitely always going to be space for people who go through it and think, this is how to use this and this is why we should use it. And I really enjoy doing that, as I know you do, as I know many do. It's actually really enjoyable to look at those extracts and look at those resources and think, actually, this is going to be really useful for this reason. And the last thing kind of that always comes up is people always say, but how do you get the time? How do you get the time amongst the madness of comprehensive teaching to do what you do? And for me, the answer is, but it keeps me sane, like amongst the minutiae of school life, which for me is slightly different now because I'm doing a slightly different role as trust lead, but still teaching, still marking, still moderating, etc. But amongst the kind of minutiae of, when you've got a form group, when you're doing phone calls home about behaviour and about uniform, when you're filling in data and you're doing all this stuff, actually for me, going back to the geography and going back to actually this is the subject that I love and this is the subject I love teaching has always, for the last 8 years, just kept me sane and kept me kind of passionate about what we do and why. So yes, of course it is work, and of course sometimes that involves working in the evenings, sometimes during the holidays, not very often / incredibly rarely, but sometimes I will engage with geography during non-work hours, but that is what has kept me kind of as passionate about doing it and as I remain. So if anyone's sitting there thinking, I'd love to do all this, I'd love to start reading the books, I'd love to get involved, my kind of advice is, well, give it a try and give it a try. And yes, it does take time, but give it a try and you might find that actually the time you're putting into it is giving you a spring in your step and inspiring and making you kind of buzzed about doing the other stuff. And so therefore it becomes completely worth it and it becomes actually really valuable into all of your work rather than seeing it as an add-on.
Yep. Doing things like this has given me so much more knowledge and understanding about geography and checking my blind spots. It's helped me to check my privilege, and you're right, it's kept me sane. It's kept me sane, and I do it through the love of the subject as well as anything else. And yeah, so I echo everything that you just said there, Kate. And then going back to like a previous point you made, you know what, there is a new up and coming thing, and maybe this is for the next generation of geographers rather than folks like you, myself, and me, is that we're entering the age of the de-influencer.
Oh.
So, folks, if you want to know what we've run out of time now. But if you want to know what I'm talking about, this is a thing now. So maybe the next generation of people who do the kind of work that myself and Kate does, maybe you will start seeing a little bit more of de-influencing going out there, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, although I don't like this reference to the next generation, Kit. It makes it sound like our time is limited. We're only just getting going.
I know. Well, I feel like I've still got a lot of legs in me, so perhaps I'm self-projecting. I don't know, but okay. As always, it's been an absolute delight to talk to you, and thank you so much for coming on the RETEACH podcasts to give that perspective. And it's great when we've got authors who are also teachers to come on this podcast as well, because it really does kind of like bring everything together. So it's been absolutely delightful to have you on and to speak to you again.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Kit. I need to engage with the RETEACH website some more and have a look at the great work you guys are doing. But it's been great to learn about it in prep for this podcast and hopefully be useful to one or two teachers or more.
Thank you so much. So, folks, this podcast was produced for RETEACH. The producer is Michael Trzynski. Visit reteach.org.uk/subject/geography for resources to help you offer students broader perspectives on key topics and free-to-access guides, all written by subject experts like Kate. I am Kit Marie, and thank you very much for joining us.